Hello again. So, welcome to lesson number 1. Just a little introduction after the introduction. I would like to let you know that the content of this course on architectural history is dedicated, it has a focus, and it's dedicated on the topic of the body in architecture. And this has to do with my own work also as architect and researcher. I did my Doktorarbeit, my PhD on this topic. So I will give you an overview on architectural history with the focus on the body. And you ask, why is this important? Why are we making a focus on the body? Well, this has to do with recent developments in the field of cognitive sciences and neurosciences that have brought a lot of insight into the workings of the human body, especially by the study of the brain, and also the growing interest in exploring holistic disciplines. So my own work as researcher integrates research, so integrates theory with practice of design, with a focus on performance art as a learning tool for architects and designers. This course is not going to have this performative aspect, so it's very focused on theory, but the focus of this theory has to do with this relationship between the human body and architecture. So you will learn about the history of architecture from this perspective of the body, and so we will start from the beginning of this history with as a kind of a mark in a chronology with the first treatise on the topic of the body and architecture, which was made by Vitruvius. So lesson number 1, this will be the lesson number 1, will introduce one more thing that I would like to tell you before we really advance, and then no more interruptions. I will be doing the course in English, in the English language, because that's where I get the material from, and it's the content which is more connected to the text and to the literature that I researched to prepare the course. It's also my second language, my work language, but I speak slowly in the videos. And also when you look at the video, please, there is always a little icon on the top right with 3 little dots, and you should click there and click Untertitel, so subtitles. And the subtitles are automatically generated by the YouTube software, and they are in English, but they are very accurate. You can follow them very well. In any case, the texts that I will upload on Moodle, which are basically the text that I'm reading from here, these texts will be translated to German. So when you listen to the video, looking at the images, and this is like your first introduction to the topics. And then when you're preparing your synthesis, your Aufgabe, when you're looking at the text again, you will read this from German. So keine panic, don't worry about the English. I mean, I'm sure all of you have very good English. I know that in Germany sometimes, often it happens, many people say, oh, but my English is not good enough. Trust me, your English is good enough. And if you have questions, of course, you can always ask, you can always recheck. But like I said, you will get the texts, and the text will be translated to German. So we make it work like this. So now we start with lesson number 1, with the storytelling, like I told you before. So the name of this lesson number 1, is the narrative body and the body of paradigm. So this lesson will introduce the topic of the human body and its connection to architecture. It provides a historical overview that considers the evolution of architecture through history from the point of view of embodiment, or experience of architectural space through the body. This lesson presents a reflection on the idea of the human body as a servant in the Roman Empire as Vitruvius has presented it to us, and reveals how the topic was assimilated into Christianity. As examples of architectural embodiment in such historical periods, the lesson navigates from the typology of the temple to the one of the cathedral. So to Vitruvius, the human body was the source of all geometry. As a man of his time, Vitruvius followed the Pythagorean tradition and considered nature as the source of all knowledge, transcript in the form of the perfect number 10. To Vitruvius, the human body is nature's work by excellence, as the only creature with 10 fingers and the ability to think, create, and fabricate objects. The Vitruvian man, you probably remember, the Vitruvian man does not move to produce geometry. He is laid flat on the ground, passive, and is made to produce it. It is at once a metaphysical proposition, a ritual formula, but above all, the architect's template, being the active agents, the architect's tools, the compass and the set square. So the Vitruvian man can be made to produce a circle and a sphere, since to the Stoics, in the words of Cicero, they alone possess the property of absolute uniformity in all their parts. No other shape can maintain the uniform motion and regular disposition of heavenly bodies. This is a citat, it's a citation from Indra Regis McEwen, and the book is Vitruvius, Writing the Body of Architecture. Being static in itself, the architect's template is a tool that represents a canon of human proportions, and its use generates motions in space. The produced results are meaningful by the architect's action and the culture to which he belongs. Leonardo da Vinci, in the Renaissance, rediscovered the Vitruvian man and gave it its most famous drawing description, in which man isn't static at all, but standing and in motion. Leonardo called this system a canon of proportions, where in the same drawing are systematized 16 possible positions for the human body, generated by variations of two main ones, overlapped and inscribed in the cosmological symbols of the circle and the set square. It must be no coincidence either that Leonardo's canon of proportions depicts a number of 16 actions. Vitruvius says in the Architectura that the Romans recognized both 6 and 10 as perfect numbers, and that joined both into one to make the supremely perfect number 16, finding the rationale for this in the foot that measures in average 16 fingers. So 16, the 4-squared number, was the agent and evidence of Roman order, while representing the Etruscan division of the sky in 4 cardinal signs, double-squared. Leonardo's interpretation of the Vitruvian man is standing, following the Roman theology of the feet. According to Indra Regis McEwen, Arrian, writing in the 2nd century AD, tells the following story about the arrival of Alexander the Great in India, which, citat, some Indian sophists were found by Alexander in the open air in a meadow, where they used to have their disputations. When they saw Alexander and his army, they did nothing but beat with their feet on the ground they stood on. When he inquired through interpreters what their action meant, they replied, "King Alexander, each man possesses no more of this earth than the patch we stand on." This story gives some meaning to the similarities found in both Vitruvius' description, Leonardo's representation of the cosmological man, and the Hindu archetypical depiction of Shiva as Nataraja, the Lord of Dancers. Please check figure 1 for Nataraja. The visual image of Nataraja achieved canonical form in the bronzes cast under the Chola dynasty in the 10th century AD, being often said to be the supreme statement of Hindu art. Shiva as Nataraja is the arch-yogi of the gods, and the system is a representation of the dance that generated yoga, which means in Sanskrit union of body, soul, and cosmos. It depicts the four-armed body of Shiva, each one representing the four cardinal directions, and therefore a square. The balance between the motions of the limbs represents its choreography, the world wilding of time, and the immobility of the serene expression in his face, the paradox between eternity and time. The ring of fire and light, the circle that circumscribes the body, represents the entire universe in cyclic rhythm and in union through motion. The gestures, also called in Sanskrit mudras, and objects in each of Shiva's hands represent the beating pulse and the sound that makes Shiva dance, the first element of the universe and the most pervasive. In Hindu mythology, this sound originated the first grammar of Sanskrit that Shiva transmitted to Panini, the great Sanskrit grammarian, and the first verse of this grammar is called the Shiva Sutra. So you probably have already opened your figure number 1, but I will zoom here. So this is one example. Shiva Nataraja, Lord of the Dancers. And why do we have this image as a connection to the topic of the Vitruvian man? Because if we look, for example, at the Vitruvian man, the figure of Leonardo da Vinci with the outstretched arms, you probably remember that sometimes in some €1 coin, the one that comes from Italy, there's a man, that's the Vitruvian man. And you should also know it from, general culture. So why do we make this parallel? Because this was an archetypal image. It was an image that has metaphysical significations and that exists in the Western culture, more famous with the drawing of Leonardo, but also in the Eastern culture. And we go to this because the interpretation that Leonardo da Vinci made of the Vitruvian man is different from the original description of Vitruvius, because this Vitruvian man from Leonardo is not standing, it's in motion. We will further develop this, but this has to do, of course, with Leonardo da Vinci's interest in the human body as the measure of all things, but also Leonardo da Vinci's interest in the human body as a kind of machine. And Leonardo was also designing machines. He was also an engineer in many ways, besides being an artist and an architect, a painter and a sculptor, so Renaissance genius. He was very interested in the topic of motion. And he was interested in the topic of motion because there's a famous citation by Leonardo that says, I am interested in the movements of people and animals because I am interested in what the movements tell about what's going on in their minds. And why do I bring up this example? I bring up this example because now, with the theories of embodiment, we know that how we move and how we express action and behavior in the world has a lot to do with how we are thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling are biological processes. It's more and more explained by neuroscience. Of course, we are not machines, and we still did not map the whole functionings of the human brain, but more and more we understand how these things are interconnected. And even better, we start to understand how our built environment in general, how architectural space or interior space, in case you are students of Innenarchitektur, so interior architecture, how the spaces we have are built because we have the body we have and we think how we do, but at the same time, these environments we construct directly affect how we feel. So this idea of embodiment in architecture and the focus of this course on this topic is made for you to be aware of this connection between body, mind, and space. So just a little parallel. I will make every now and then these comments, and then I will continue with the text. So this grammar of movements, which is encoded in Nataraj's depiction of Shiva was transmitted from generation to generation, extending many symbolic gestures and actions related to spirituality, dance, and religion. These yoga postures provide a link to some of the most primitive traditions of reverence to nature, being based in elementary and symbolic geometrical shapes such as the triangle, the square, the pentagon, and the hexagon, and are encrusted in the matrix of our collective subconscious. In Eastern culture, yoga practice is believed to have a very powerful psychophysiological effect in the individual, expanding his consciousness and improving his overall health and longevity. We now return to the point where we started with this theoretical review, which is Vitruvius de Arquitectura. It's an invaluable source of knowledge on classical architecture, even if all the original images that accompanied the text were lost. But for this reason, many artists in the Renaissance tried to, because in the Renaissance there was resurgence of the interest in classical culture, and therefore the text from Vitruvius was found again, was illustrated, and it was distributed also as a book. So here you have Leonardo da Vinci's, please look, figure 1.2. This is the Vitruvian Man, the interpretation by Leonardo da Vinci. And here we have in figure 1.3, the Vitruvian Man by Cesare Cesariano. So you see the circle and the set square. In this case, the arms are not outstretched like here. There's not so many possibilities of motion. There's diagonal, and also the center is not in the same place. And now the figure 1.4 is from Francesco di Giorgio Martini, and it's also a Vitruvian Man. And this one turns a little bit to the side, and you see that the circle and the set square are also inscribed a little bit differently. You should have your PDF file with the images open so you can see the images better, but I just show them here simultaneously so that this doesn't become, too abstract. But we make here a little bit of stop because we are already going, making a jump to the Renaissance, and before we arrive to the Renaissance, we have to go to the we have to go a little bit before. Although, of course, I made a pause because now I have to relocate myself. We do make this jump to the Renaissance because that's when the interest, like I mentioned before, the interest in classical architecture bloomed again, and so all these images appeared. But later, from 1743 to 1747, for example, Piranesi would devote himself to the documentation of classical buildings in Italy. So there was again in the 18th century with the travels in Europe, there were artists and scholars who were again interested in classical tradition and who were studying the buildings mostly by drawing, by representation. It's not, in fact, rarely that when we search for the topic of the body in architecture, immediate mental associations bring up Leonardo's famous illustration of the Vitruvian Man. And the same thing happens if one makes, for instance, an internet or library search. Historically, one doesn't find a gap in the interest in the body as an architectural subject. Quite the contrary, Leonardo's image simply made it more popular during the Renaissance. Already during the last stages of the Roman Empire, due to the growing influence of Christianity, classical architecture began to be adapted to serve another body, the body of Christ, embodied through its followers. If before buildings and the city reflected the power of the empire, its victory, prosperity, strength, and youth, by the Middle Ages a new paradigm reigned and set the thinking of its time. So please check figure 5 and figure 6 to link to what I mentioned before. As the Romans replaced the Greeks' gods and myths, as well as people's habits and social order, the Christians replaced the former classical values with the narrative and symbols of their religion. Instead of the Olympic, victorious and healthy body of Greco-Roman tradition, the body and therefore the architecture of the Middle Ages is a humble body of pain and illness. A body which represents the embodied suffering of Christ, made flesh by God to redeem and offer hope to the social collective that follows him. This mostly illiterate social body accepts its daily pains of hunger, plague, and death, as Christian architecture gives it hope through words, images, and sensuous bliss. The cathedral is the place of healing, body and soul, where incense cleanses foul earthly smells, and angels sing inspiring visions of the sublime in the mysterious Latin language. Light showers from the high sky, and man feels united with the divine in this sacred place. Please check figure 1.7, 1.8, and 1.9, where we have 3 representations of the cathedral, medieval cathedral. One could also have referred now, as example, to other religious traditions, such as Eastern religions, but we choose to take as an example the one which we are exposed to, so the Christian tradition, as it seems more honest to recall also from our personal experiences and sensations, and to be able to discuss. I mean, of course not all of us are Christian or have a Christian background, but surely one had the experience of visiting such a sacred space. But for example, if you did not have this experience, if you come from another culture, if you're Muslim or Jewish, for example, you can still refer to this kind of experience of transcendence through architectural space, through another kind of sacred building. So even for someone who does not have religious education or so, or if you are not religious or anti-religious, just from the point of building and of architecture, it is anthropologically a fact that our embodied sensuous experience is a very important part in ritual, in religions, and in mystical traditions, and it was already in the most primitive cultures. This is also part of being human. One can make a comparison with other kind of experiences. For example, this kind of very strong somatic, that you feel it with your body, experiences which are induced by the built contexts. An example, for example, in ancient Rome, would be to view a gladiator's fight in the Colosseum, which was definitely very intense and a visceral experience. But we can think nowadays about contemporary collective rituals, such as going to a concert or watching a match in a football stadium, or even going to the mall, going shopping, doing this kind of rituals in specific buildings that give us this kind of experience of space. In the case of Christianity and of Christian building, faith was also built upon this somatic, this physical experience, and the empathy produced by symbols, be they the images, the sculptures, or the relics, not necessarily by only a rational understanding of the Latin words which were being said, and the text, which was always rather complex. So it was built upon individual participation in a collective performance conducted by a legitimate representative of Christ in the case of the medieval church. So as illustration, please check figure 1.10, 1.11 and 1.12. But here we make another stop to pin down an important fact: the relationship between context and narrative. After our previous arguments, we can logically deduce that the body, and so architecture, as transmitters of signs, follow the mainstream thinking of their time. Because we're always expressing, in German you say the Zeitgeist, the thinking of the time, spirit of the time. Be that the represented body of architecture or the living human body. Both are in the culture, and we can't avoid but express the current paradigm, the current culture. But we can also change it. Also, regarding the previous examples, one has to accept the historical fact that theology had a rather promiscuous relationship with scientific thinking in the Middle Ages, at least until the end of the 17th century. And of course, this was transmitted to different dispositions towards the body, and therefore architecture as its host and their role as locals of science. Even so, especially if one takes a closer look at the arduous work of some medieval philosophers and thinkers regarding the topic of the body, it's surprising to see how there were already some attempts to unify diversified fields of knowledge to achieve an understanding of what it means to be human. It's particularly interesting to see how fundamental topics of architecture, such as the use of mathematics and geometry, especially in the tradition of Pythagoras and Euclid, were applied to geography, astronomy, astrology, biology, and to some extent anatomy, and of course architecture. In medieval Persia, for example, medicine was furthermore developed than in Europe at the same time, in the Middle Ages, thanks to the possibility of dissecting human bodies to study. In Europe, it was only in the Renaissance that thinkers such as Leonardo da Vinci pioneered by taking the risk of stealing or making obscure arrangements to get their hands on the bodies of the dead to examine. It also wasn't very likely that this would have happened before, since the plague forced dead bodies to remain buried deep into the ground, never to return to the surface. Still, medieval attempts to understand what it means to be human left many examples of extreme interests and artistic beauty. The sacred human body, inviolable, not dissected, should remain as mysterious as the divine. This was the dogma of the church. It was the rule. You cannot open a human body. In these works, mostly luminaries or charts, we find the same search for harmony and proportion, the concern for the human scale regarding the universe, and through the arduous study of geometry, finding meaning in the prevalence of certain patterns in many different aspects of man, the world, and the cosmos. Therefore, and still under the supervision of the Church, many attempts for a cosmology were done, mixing together the knowledge of the time, the Christian narrative, but also traces from classical mythology, these mostly hidden under intricate geometric symbols. Please check figure 1.15. It's the Ebstorf map, and it's a fragment, and it's meant for you to see a little bit like one of these representations of the human body, of course identified with the body of Christ. There's a lot of storytelling, so describing the ideas that this drawing represents, and of course there's Adam and Eve and a kind of mixing of the creation of man and this creation myth that was described in the Bible. So the medieval attempts to explain what it means to be human and how the narratives and the attitude on the human body was directly affected by this. If we disregard the inaccuracies that come from what can be seen by our contemporary eyes as a naive mixture between scientific knowledge, religion, and folklore, these obscure mappa mundi can already be seen as translations of a form of holistic thinking, which opened the path for the Renaissance curiosity and persistency in the search for truth. These were the times when universities bloomed, and so did the research of scientific evidence as a basis for knowledge. Science couldn't accept mystery and speculation anymore. So, as Prometheus from the myth disobeyed by giving fire to mankind, so did Leonardo and his contemporaries disrobe the classical body to go beyond its boundaries of stone and reveal its flesh through science and art. The body of the Renaissance, and of course the architecture that hosts the body of the Renaissance, was still mystical and sacred, but this time not as sinful containers of flesh, but as the invaluable key which holds the secrets for the understanding of the world, macrocosmos through microcosmos. One could call this Renaissance body the body of knowledge, although this is already a very risky label. Therefore, we stick to the generally accepted term of humanist body. Please check figure 1.16, 1.17, and 1.18. It is important to note here that for the purpose of our discussion, it is necessary to make this historical revision to understand to which extent the different approaches on the subject of the body were intimately related to time and context and how this affected architecture. So in figure 1.19, you have the painting, very famous painting from Raphael, the School of Athens, where you see representation of the philosophers of ancient Greece discussing, talking, developing new theories. And you see that the building, which is represented in the painting, of course, the painting makes very skillful use of perspective, which was the favorite Renaissance medium of representation of a scene, to create a scene with a fixed observer, like an eye or a camera. And then we have the building. And of course, this Inszenierung of the building, the staging, the design of this building, follows, of course, a canon of proportions. It follows the laws of nature. It uses clear geometries, symmetries, harmonies, polyrhythms, all these architecture elements that are characteristic from the Renaissance. And this is the end of lesson number 1. Of course, there would always be much more to say, but we will continue very soon with lesson number 2. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you have questions, if you want to know a little bit more, please write in the comments, give me some feedback, and most of all, enjoy reading the text again in German. Find the information that you find useful, extract, find what you find good for you, make questions. I would be curious about your questions too. So, until next lesson, stay active, stay safe, and stay calm.